The purpose of this series is to provide an overview of select vintage and modern games, their pros and cons, and what are the essential books and items that you need to play them. With different editions, multiple games appearing to be similar on the surface, and a huge variety of supplements and expansions, newcomers and even some veterans can often find it a daunting and confusing place to be, and this series hopes to lend a helping hand. And this time out, one of the original tools for solo role-playing, Tunnels and Trolls. One of the main elements that role-playing games encouraged, and still do, if you're of a mindset to wander off the beaten path, is getting your hands dirty with the nuts and bolts and simply making stuff up. The concept of role-playing as we know it was built on exactly that. Gamers making up new ways to play games such as diplomacy, making new uses out of rules such as chainmail, building their own frameworks in which to play their visions of worlds and the rules that might govern them. This led to Dungeons & Dragons, Boot Hill, Traveller, RuneQuest, On Guard, and other games that form part of the first wave, including Tunnels and Trolls, our subject for today. Self-published in April in 1975 by Ken St. Andre, Tunnels and Trolls was designed to be a simpler look at fantasy role-playing. Having read his friend's Dungeons & Dragons books, St. Andre found the rules too confusing, and so set out writing his own game. Instead of odd-shaped dice, he stuck to standard six-siders. Instead of some of the more mathematical elements of Dungeons & Dragons, he opted for a simple skill system. On the surface, Tunnels and Trolls resembled D&D in its use of classes and races and ability scores, but departed from it by being much simpler in its structure. A second edition of the game was picked up by Flying Buffalo in the June of 1975, and established itself as a competitor to Dungeons & Dragons itself. Even further than that, Flying Buffalo worked out licenses for the game with a number of overseas publishers, which is how it ended up with a UK edition. In 1979, published by Chris Harvey Games, ahead of any similar offerings from TSR. By 1979, Tunnels and Trolls had entered its fifth edition, which gives you at least some idea of how rapidly it was being developed and revised. However, from a UK gamer's perspective, the edition that we are most familiar with did not arrive until 1986. This, as another reworking of the 5th edition rules, was published by Corgi Books. By this time, the idea of solitary game books, something the Tunnels and Trolls rules had, along with play-by-mail, found that they slotted easily into, was very well established in the UK. Muffin had released the first fighting fantasy book, The Warlock of Firetop Mountain, in 1982. Created, no doubt, under the influence of Tunnels and Trolls by Games Workshop's Steve Jackson, no, not the American of Ogre and GURPS fame, and Ian Livingstone. These led to other similar works, for example, the Lone Wolf series by Joe Deaver in 1984. Riding on the tide of this, Corgi republished a number of Tunnels and Trolls scenarios and the core rulebook in a standard novel size, often doubling up scenarios that did not have a large enough page count alone. NAKEDDOOM and Deathtrap Equalized Dungeon, The Amulet of the Salkti and Arena of Kazan, Captive d'Ivoire and Beyond the Silvered Pane, The City of Terrors, Gamesman of Khazar and Mistywood, and Sword for Hire, Blue Frog Tavern. Over in the US, many more adventures had been released, only a handful of which were being picked up by Chris Harvey or Corgi in the UK. Buffalo Castle in 1976, Dargon's Dungeon, Deathtrap Equalizer Dungeon, Dungeon of the Bear, and Weird World in 1977, Beyond the Silvered Pane, City of Terrors, and Uncle Ugly's Underground Doom in 1978. Monsters! Reworked from a 1976 metagaming supplement, Goblin Lake, Labyrinth, Sorcerer Solitaire, NAKEDDOOM, Sword for Hire, and Arena of Kazan in 1979. Abyss, Overkill, Circle of Ice, and Sewers of Oblivion in 1980. Blue Frog Tavern, Catacombs of the Bear Cult, City of Terrors, Mistywood, Sea of Mystery in 1981. Castle Ward, Gamesman of Khazar in 1982. Beyond the Silvered Pane in 1983, Amulet of the Sulcti, Beyond the Wall of Tears, Captive d'Avoir, The Isle of Dark Smoke in 1984, Red Circle in 1987, Caravan to Tierne in 1989, and Dark Temple in 1991, When the Cat's Away in 1993, and Griffin Ridge in 2006, alongside several editions of certain choice morsels among these. Unique scenarios and supplements were not limited to Flying Buffalo. Rider Fantasy published Castles and Kingdoms, Demons and Knotmen, then Dimensions and Doors in 1978. Infinity Inc. published Agent of Death in 1983, to name but two. And of course, our old friends Judges Guild got in on the Tunnels and Trolls cart with the Toughest Dungeon in the World in 1980, Rat on a Stick in 1982, and Jungle of Lost Souls in 1983. A new edition, 5.5, was released in 2005, some 26 years after 5th. With the role-playing game industry being on a roller coaster through the 1990s, and Flying Buffalo not having gained the same level of traction through the 1980s as TSR and Dungeons & Dragons had, pouring in more support couldn't have been the first thing on their minds. With the advent of the OGL and the Dungeons & Dragons 3rd edition, revitalising the role-playing game industry into the 2000s, and with nostalgia being generated by the old-school renaissance, the OSR, it was perhaps inevitable that Tunnels and Trolls should resurface for some air. Enter Fiery Dragon Productions, a role-playing game company set up in 2000 to take advantage of the OGL and the D20 licence. Flying Buffalo licensed them to produce a 30th anniversary edition of the game, which they released in a box in 2005. An update to this edition was released in 2008, again by Fiery Dragon, labelled as Edition 7.5. Current edition of the game is 8th edition, published once more by Flying Buffalo in 2015 on the back of a Kickstarter project. Despite its niche, underrated status, and never having attracted an audience on the scale of Dungeons & Dragons and other more well-known role-playing games, Tunnels & Trolls is nevertheless a fun game to play. As a cap to this history section, it's interesting to note that Flying Buffalo are the longest surviving role-playing game company, and that is no small feat. Tunnels and Trolls is a simple game, which is why it is ideally suited to solo and play by mail or email or whatever. At its heart, the system is a roll a number of six-sided dice, add a modifier and compare to another number. Sometimes that other number is fixed, for example by the difficulty of a particular task. Sometimes it is another dice roll, for example in combat, where combatants pit accumulated dice and modifiers for weapons, skills, magic and so on against each other. Characters are defined by kindred, type, prime attributes and talents. Prime attributes are self-explanatory, being strength, constitution, dexterity, speed, luck, intelligence, wizardry and charisma. Each of these is rolled using 3 six-sided dice for a range of 3 to 18. Kindred, the character's species, provides some special capabilities, but mostly provides multipliers to the character's prime attributes. For example, a character of human kindred has a multiplier of 1 across the board, while a fairy has a quarter strength but double wizardry. Strength, luck, dexterity and speed of exceptional, that is, of greater than 12, contribute to personal adds. This is a modifier, and each of those attributes provide +1 per point over 12 to it. Attributes are used to determine saving roll targets. A saving roll is as it sounds, a roll that must be succeeded to avoid some effect or otherwise determine a situation's outcome. The difficulty of the saving roll is determined by level. A level 1 roll has a base target of 20, and each level adds 5 to that. So, for example, a level 2 roll would be 25, level 3 would be 30, and so on. The relevant attribute is then subtracted from this to create a target number, to a minimum of 4, that must be rolled equal to or higher on 2d6. For example, a character with a dexterity of 18 must make a level 2 dexterity saving roll against a target of 7. Character type is equivalent to class or profession, and in Tunnels and Trolls there are 3: warrior, wizard and rogue. Warriors gain bonuses to weapons and armour but cannot cast spells. Wizards can cast spells, but have limitations in weapon combat. Rogues are halfway between the two, with flexible access to the skills of warriors and wizards. Finally, talents are areas of expertise that are assigned to round characters out a bit. Broadly speaking, a talent provides a bonus to rolls made where it is deemed the character's chances of success would be heightened by her experience. Combat is very simple. Each weapon type has a combat dice roll. Magical properties may increase this. In a round of combat, both opponents roll their weapon dice and add their personal adds. The difference between the two rolls is the damage inflicted by the highest rolling party onto the lowest. All sixes rolled count as spite damage, 1 point per 6. This is the damage that affects the opposing party even if the side did not get the larger score. For example, a character rolls 2 3s and a 6 for a total of 12 against an opponent that rolls 15 from 3 5s. They would lose that round of the fight and would take 3 points of damage. However, the 6 they rolled counts as spite, and so they will at least get 1 point of damage back onto their opponent this round. Multiple combatants on the same side stack their rolls. While it is easy enough to conduct a combat on an individual character and monster basis, it is far easier to abstract the combat and boil it down to one pool of dice versus another. Magic is similarly simple. Spells have a minimum requirement in attributes and cost a certain amount of wizardry to cast. There are 18 levels of spells with increasing requirements and costs. As characters do what characters are wont to do, they pick up adventure points. These are gained from saving rolls, combat, treasure, social interaction, and anything else that the solo adventure or the games master awards them for. These points are spent on raising attributes, acquiring talents, or acquiring magical knowledge. Characters also possess a level, which carries some benefits. Level is determined by the tens of the highest attribute the character possesses. For example, a character with the highest attribute of 25 would be 2nd level, while one with the highest attribute of 41 would be 4th level. For fighters, level adds to their combat pool. For wizards, it reduces the cost in wizardry for casting spells. For rogues, it reflects an increase in the broad flexibility represented by that class. As for the nature of play, we've mentioned that Tunnels and Trolls is ideal for solo and referee play. Solo scenarios are generally of the numbered paragraph type. If you go in this direction, turn to paragraph X. If this happens, go to paragraph Y. They are more flexible and open than the fighting fantasy game books that came after them, but at the same time, they do not approach the flexibility of a refereed game. A refereed game of Tunnels and Trolls plays pretty much like any other fantasy role-playing game. The players determine the actions of their characters, the referees determine the actions of every other character and monster, and is the arbiter of outcomes. The game takes itself less seriously than its contemporaries, and this is usually reflected in its play. It is also very possible to run, for example, Dungeons and Dragons adventures using Tunnels and Trolls. Because the game is relatively rules and statistics light, anything specific to a particular game system can pretty much be converted finger in the air style on the fly. Tunnels and Trolls is an often overlooked member of that exclusive first wave of role-playing games club. It predates every other member of that club other than Dungeons and Dragons, and has been consistently in print since its inception. Much of the criticism of the game is levelled at what I see as its major strength. It is simplistic. It does not go into weapon speeds, detailed character development, spell descriptions of an almost scientific nature or complex background details. It is very much along the lines of get stuck in quickly and drive through the teeth of the action without worrying too much about the specifics. In this, it plays much more like high-action swords and sorcery, and stands as a proud intermediary between the lawless playground games of Bang, You're Dead, and the much greater structure of RuneQuest and Dungeons and Dragons. So, if exciting action and play are more your thing than graduated statistics, then Tunnels and Trolls may well be the game for you. If the Corgi books were still in print and available for reasonable prices, I would recommend those. However, there are a few alternatives. The rules and many of the published adventures, solo and refereed, are available for order from flyingbuffalo.com. Flying Buffalo also have many offerings on Drive-Thru RPG, both for Tunnels and Trolls and of a more generic nature. For a starting adventure, I recommend Beyond the Silvered Pane, Arena of Kazan, Buffalo Castle, or NAKEDDOOM. All of those are fun and give a fair introduction. After that, it's up to you. There is quite a lot of support material out there for Tunnels and Trolls, and as I've mentioned, virtually any published adventure for any other game can be played using its rules. I still do have a fondness for the City of Terrors. Tunnels and Trolls does not pretend to be detailed, realistic, complex, or all-encompassing. Instead, it is easy to pick up, fast and fun to play, and so open that creating monsters, adventures, and anything else for it is a doddle. Coupled with a spark of humour, it is a great game to play with kids that may otherwise be daunted by bulkier games such as Dungeons & Dragons. As for solo play, there is no better. If killing an hour or two delving on your own is your thing, then certainly give Tunnels and Trolls a fly.